All right, hello class. Thank you so much for joining me today. So what we're going to be doing with today's lecture is we're going to be taking these tools we've been learning about market power and competitive equilibrium and using them to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of the labor market. Now, the reason we're going to spend time on the labor market specifically is really twofold. So the first is just that the labor market is a really important market, right? Most of us are going to get almost all of our lifetime consumption, our lifetime income, is going to come from selling our labor, right? Is going to come from working for wages. And as a result, understanding labor markets is really key to understanding a lot of the most important questions in the world about people's ability to earn a living, right? So if we want to understand the reasons that income inequality has been growing over time and wages have been stagnating for about the bottom 50% of the population, if we want to understand persistent wage gaps by gender or by race, we're going to want to understand the labor market in as much depth as possible. And likewise, if we want to understand lots of issues connected to the labor market, right, like education policy or tax policy or welfare policy, we're going to want to have the strongest understanding of the labor market we can. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that labor markets are the most prominent example of what we like to call factor markets, which is essentially, right, markets for inputs in production rather than markets for final products. So as we talked about when we talked about producer theory, the reason that firms hire workers, same with the reason firms hire capital or land or any other sorts of inputs, isn't because the firms have preferences for workers, right? It's not just because they like having workers. It's because they want to use those workers to produce other products. And so as a result, the dynamics of demand for labor are going to be a little bit different than the dynamics of demand for final products, right? Things like toothpaste or concerts or frozen yogurt. And likewise, right, labor supply is going to be different from the supply of other types of goods because individual human beings supply labor, and so their supply of labor is going to depend on their preferences rather than just depending on profit maximization. So our basic plan for the day is we're going to first go over really a pretty simple framework of labor supply and labor demand. Think a little bit more carefully than we have before about supply and demand for labor. And then we're going to do some basic policy analysis. So we're going to ask, in a competitive labor market, what would be the consequences of various strategies to try to increase wages, things like wage subsidies or minimum wages? And then how do those strategies work differently when labor markets are not competitive, when either firms or workers have power to set wages? Okay, perfect. So let's start out by going back to our analysis in Unit 1 of individuals' labor supply. And what we're going to do this time is, once we've thought through an individual's labor supply, we're going to think a little bit about how that might compare to the supply of labor to a particular occupation or even to the whole economy. So as you guys might remember, our basic argument about labor supply is that workers supply labor because their goal is to buy consumption, right? In other words, the reason that we go work for a living is so that we can afford to live in a home, eat food, right, go out to the movies, do all of these things that require money. And the reason we don't work 100% of our time, right, the reason we don't work 24 hours a day, is because we also value our time away from work, right? So by working, we're giving up leisure, but we're gaining consumption. And as a result, if we want to understand our choices of leisure and consumption, right, our choices of how much to work, we're going to want to think about a budget constraint where we're comparing various values of leisure and consumption, right? We have maybe a budget constraint like this, where we have some non-labor income, right, if we're lucky, and then we have a wage rate, right, and each hour of leisure that we give up gains us W units of consumption. So we're thinking about a particular day, right, we might say that we've got 24 hours of leisure to burn, and we could get up to 24W plus our non-labor income in consumption, right? And what do? Well, we have preferences, right, which we can represent with indifference curves over various combinations of leisure and consumption. And we'll choose our favorite thing, right? So the way that I drew this, maybe I'll say that this particular person wants to take 12 hours a day of leisure, right? And work the rest of the time, right? Their labor is going to be 24 minus 12. 1. So in most respects, right, this decision that we're talking about right here, where we're deciding how much leisure to take and how much consumption to take, is going to look just like most of our consumer decisions, right? Essentially, we're going to have preferences, we're going to have budget constraints, and we're going to choose our combination of leisure and consumption that maximizes our utility. The only thing that's really going to be different about this versus other sorts of consumption decisions is the fact that we own our leisure. And as a result, we're going to have a budget constraint that looks something like C plus WL equals W times 24 minus L plus non-labor income, right? And as a consequence, when our wage increases, leisure gets more expensive and we get richer, right? So we have this concept where an increase in the wage is going to have a substitution effect that pushes us to take less leisure, right? Because now leisure is more expensive, right? The cost of leisure went up. But it's going to have an income effect that when leisure is a normal good, is going to push us to take more leisure, right? Because the W is over here, right on the income side of our budget constraint as well, right? As wage gets up, we get wealthier. When we get wealthier, we want all of the things that we like. We want more of all the things we like, more of all our normal goods. So we're going to end up wanting to take more leisure and more consumption. And as a result of this, right, we argued that if we wanted to draw our labor supply curve, right, an individual supply of labor at different wages, essentially what we'd be doing, we'd be asking what's your optimal choice of leisure and consumption, various wages, right? Let's say W is 5, W is 10, is 20, W is 50. And we argued that what we might expect to see is that at very, very low wages, you're going to work very little, right? At a wage of 0, you wouldn't work at all. So as your income increases, right, you're going to work more hours. If you go from, say, $5 an hour to $10 an hour, but then as your income gets even higher, right, let's say you go from $10 an hour to $20 an hour, you might start working less, right? At low levels of at low wages, we might expect that the income effect is going to be dominated by the substitution effect. But then at high levels of wages, we might expect the opposite. We might expect that the income effect would start becoming larger than the substitution effect. Right, so that we end up with an individual's labor supply curve that bends backwards. Right, that increases as we increase wages up to a point, but then begins to decrease as we increase wages even further. The main reason that I want to revisit this is to remind you that an individual's labor supply curve is going to end up looking really weird, right? It's a very strange thing to have a supply curve in a market that ends up sloping down in some segments. And so this might make us wonder, in the real world, if we're thinking about labor supply to a particular occupation, or even labor supply to the economy as a whole, are we likely to see a downward sloping labor supply curve, right? Or are we expecting to see supply curves that are a little bit more conventional, right? That increase, where, a labor supply increases as we increase our wage. So there's going to be a couple of reasons for us to think that while an individual's labor supply is going to slope down at some wages, right? This is a real behavior we expect to see in the world, that the labor supply to a particular occupation or to the economy as a whole is much more likely to slope up like a normal labor supply curve, and in general is going to be much more likely to be more elastic than an individual's labor supply curve. In other words, that raising wages is going to increase the amount of labor supplied to the economy or the amount of labor supplied to an occupation by more than we'd expect if we just thought about an individual's decision about how much to work at different wages. So what are the reasons we might think that the labor supply to an occupation as a whole or to an economy as a whole is going to increase more when we increase wages than will the labor supply of a particular individual? Well, so the first reason we might think this, we talked a little bit about Unit 1, is timing. So essentially the idea here is, with the graph I just drew, right, where I've got leisure and consumption, I've got some budget constraint like this with a slope of W, right? This budget constraint is assuming that my consumption today comes entirely from the amount of money that I make today, right? As a result of this, when I think about income effects, I'm going to think that an increase in wage today is going to make me about as much richer as it is going to increase my substitution between leisure and consumption, right? If I get a raise, let's say a 20% raise, right? That's going to increase the amount of consumption that I'll have today by 20%. It's also going to increase the cost of leisure by 20%. But in the real world, right, people are able to borrow and save. Right, we're not just consuming what we made today when we make our consumption decisions. We can make money today and use it tomorrow. We can also use money today that we're going to make tomorrow, right, by using a credit card or something similar, taking out student loans. And so as a result, if we think about the income effect that comes from a temporary increase in wages, we might think that the income effect is going to be a lot smaller than we'd expect looking just at this picture. Right, if I get a 20% raise for the next year, I'm not going to treat that as if I'm 20% richer for the entirety of my life. And as a result, whereas the substitution effect is still going to be 20%, right? An hour of leisure today is still going to cost me 20% more than it did before I got my raise. So as a result of that, right, because of borrowing and saving, income effects are going to be smaller from temporary wage changes. Cool. Another way to think about this, by the way, is that if we think about an increase in wages right now, right, an increase in wages today, we might not see that much difference in people's, the income effects today might be relatively small, right? We'll see lots of people working more today. But we might have a larger income effect, or have that income effect play out over the course of the rest of people's lives. So a boom year this year where people are able to bolster their savings, pay down their student loans, put money in their retirement accounts, buy houses, etc., might lead more people to retire 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road, right? Or retire a few years earlier than they would if they didn't have a couple of really good earnings years. But if we're looking at essentially the relationship between the wages a firm's going to offer right now, or an occupation offers right now, and the number of people willing to work there right now, we're going to see that positive relationship that comes through the substitution effect. Awesome. Okay. Another reason is what we're going to call the extensive margin. What this means is essentially that a lot of the aggregate labor supply changes we see when we change wages don't come through an individual deciding to work a few hours more or a few hours less. They come from individuals deciding whether to work at all or whether to leave the labor force. So to think about this, let's try a slightly fancier labor supply budget constraint. So you might remember, in one of your problem set questions, we thought about somebody who had a commute to work, right? And this is something that is going to be true in one respect or another for a lot of people, is that when you decide to work, you can't just start earning wages immediately, right? If you decide that you're going to put in 10 or 15 hours of, or 10 or 15 minutes of work a day, right? In order to earn any money at all, you're going to have to impose some costs on yourself. You're going to have to take time to get to work. You're going to have to put together a resume and send it out to people, right? You're going to have to put on pants every morning and take a shower, at least when you're not doing Zoom classes. So as a result of all that, right, we might expect that instead of having budget constraints that look like this, right, we might expect that there's some cost in order to work at all, right? So with non-labor income, we might expect to see budget constraints that look more like this, right? Where this is essentially the fixed cost of working, right? And this is the non-labor income. So what does this mean? It means that you're able to consume something without working at all, right? If you've got savings, if you've got family, if you've got some ability to take advantage of social welfare programs, etc., right? And in order to work at all, you're going to have to impose some cost on yourself through commuting, through filling out applications, etc. Now, the reason that this is important, the reason this creates an extensive margin, is it means that each person is going to have some minimum wage at which they're willing to work any hours at all. So we can imagine, for some particular person, right, let's say that this is your indifference curve, your optimal choice is going to be not working, right? Because this point on your budget constraint is better than all of the working points in your budget constraint. The absolute minimum wage you'll take in order to work at all is going to be the one where the part of your budget constraint where you're working touches the same indifference curve as the part of your budget constraint where you're not working at all, right? But if you work at all, and these are your preferences, you're not going to go from working 0 hours, right, taking 24 hours of leisure, to taking 23 hours of leisure or something. You might go all the way to working 8 hours a day, right? So in this case, there's this pretty big jump in the number of hours that you work. This pretty big jump in the number of hours that you work that comes from being offered just enough to get you into the labor market at all. We call this your reservation wage. So if we've got a whole bunch of different people, all of whom have different reservation wages, we expect that as we increase wages, right, we're going to pull more and more people into the labor force. We're going to have more and more people applying for jobs. And that's going to result in an upward sloping supply of labor to the economy, even if, for any particular individual, a wage increase above their reservation wage wouldn't make much difference in the number of hours that they work. So overall, what we're saying is wage increases bring people into the economy. And then one last thing, right, which I'm not going to dwell on too much, is if we're thinking about the amount of labor supplied to an occupation, rather than the amount of labor supplied to the economy as a whole, or the amount of labor supplied by an individual, we're also going to think about people making the decision, not do I work or not work, but do I want to work as a dentist, or do I want to work as a ophthalmologist, right? Do I want to work as a cashier? Do I want to work as a maintenance worker, right? And so as a result, when wages increase in an occupation, we might expect more people to work in that occupation, more hours of labor to be supplied in that occupation, not necessarily because individuals are working more who are already, say, sanitation workers, but because some individuals who would have been cashiers are instead going to become sanitation workers. So I'll call this occupation changing. So, long story short, what we're going to see here is that whenever we're doing analysis of labor markets, right, where we're thinking about aggregate supply of labor, we're generally going to expect supply curves to slope upward, just like they do in other sorts of markets. But that doesn't mean that we should forget about where that labor supply decision is coming from, that it's coming from individuals making decisions about how much their marginal hour of leisure is worth. Okay, perfect.